You're watching WLVT PBS Kids. You're watching Alaska Public Media PBS Kids.
You're watching APT PBS Kids.
You're watching Arizona PBS Kids.
You're watching Arkansas PBS Kids.
You're watching AZPM PBS Kids.
You're watching Both State PBS Kids.
You're watching Basin PBS Kids. You're watching Blue Ridge PBS Kids. You're watching BPTV PBS Kids. You're watching WNED PBS Kids. You're watching CET PBS Kids. You're watching CPTV PBS Kids.
You're watching Dawa International Media PBS Kids. You're watching Dawa International Media PBS Kids.
You're watching Delta PBS Kids.
You're watching Detroit PBS Kids. You're watching ET PBS PBS Kids.
You're watching GBH Kids.
You're watching GPB PBS Kids. You're watching Houston Public Media PBS Kids. You're watching Idaho PBS Kids. You're watching IdeaStream PBS Kids. You're watching Iowa PBS Kids.
You're watching Jazz PBS Kids. You're watching Kansas City PBS Kids.
You're watching Kati Public Television PBS Kids. You're watching Kati Public Television PBS Kids.
You're watching KBTC Public Television PBS Kids. You're watching KEDT PBS Kids. You're watching KEET PBS Kids.
You're watching KENW PBS Kids.
You're watching KERA PBS Kids. You're watching KET PBS Kids. You're watching KIXE PBS Kids. Watching KLRN PBS Kids. You're watching KMOS PBS Kids. You're watching KPBS Kids. You're watching KQED PBS Kids. You're watching KRWG PBS Kids. You're watching KSMQ PBS Kids. You're watching KSPS PBS Kids. You're watching KTWU PBS Kids. You're watching KUAC PBS Kids. You're watching KVCR PBS Kids. You're watching KWCN PBS Kids. You're watching Lakeland PBS Kids. You're watching Lakeshore PBS Kids.
You're watching LPB PBS Kids.
You're watching Maine Public Broadcasting PBS Kids. You're watching MET PBS Kids. You're watching Milwaukee PBS Kids. You're watching Maryland Public Television PBS Kids.
You're watching Montana PBS Kids. You're watching Mountain Lake PBS Kids.
You're watching WGBY PBS Kids. You're watching New Hampshire PBS Kids. You're watching KET PBS Kids. You're watching NJTV PBS Kids.
You're watching NM PBS Kids.
You're watching Northern California Public Media PBS Kids. You're watching NPT PBS Kids. You're watching KWSU PBS Kids. You're watching Oklahoma ETV PBS Kids. You're watching OPB PBS Kids. You're watching Ozarks Public Television PBS Kids. You're watching Panhandle PBS Kids. You're watching PBS Charlotte PBS Kids. You're watching PBS El Paso PBS Kids. Watching PBS Fort Wayne PBS Kids. You're watching KGTF PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Hawaii
PBS
PBS Kids.
You're watching WILL TV PBS Kids. You're watching KAMU PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Kansas PBS Kids.
You're watching KLCS PBS Kids. You're watching KBIE PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Michiana Kids.
You're watching WDSE PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS North Carolina PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Reno PBS Kids. You're watching PBS SoCal Kids. You're watching PBS Kids Texas Tech Public Media. You're watching PBS Kids Utah. You're watching Western Reserve PBS Kids. You're watching WGVU PBS Kids. You're watching WHYY PBS Kids. You're watching PBS Wisconsin PBS Kids. You're watching WKAR PBS Kids. You're watching WOUB Public Media PBS Kids. You're watching WTJX PBS Kids. You're watching WUFT PBS Kids. You're watching BIA PBS Kids. You're watching Pioneer PBS Kids. You're watching Prairie Public PBS Kids. You're watching Rocky Mountain PBS Kids.
You're watching Roma Media PBS Kids. You're watching Roma Media PBS Kids.
You're watching South Carolina ETV PBS Kids.
You're watching SETI PBS Media Kids. You're watching SETI PBS Media Kids.
You're watching Smoky Hills PBS Kids. You're watching South Dakota PTV PBS Kids. You're watching WMTJ PBS Kids.
You're watching South Florida PBS Kids.
You're watching WXEL PBS Kids. You're watching Southern Oregon PBS Kids. You're watching Think TV PBS Kids. You're watching WNET PBS Kids. You're watching Twin Cities PBS Kids. You're watching Valley PBS Kids. You're watching Vegas PBS Kids.
You're watching Vermont PBS Kids.
You're watching Vincent's PBS Kids. You're watching WPBA PBS Kids. You're watching WBGU TV PBS Kids. You're watching WCMU PBS Kids. You're watching WCNY PBS Kids.
You're watching WCTE PBS Kids. You're watching WEGU PBS Kids.
You're watching WEIU PBS Kids. You're watching WLJT PBS Kids. You're watching West Virginia Public Broadcasting PBS Kids. You're watching WETA PBS Kids. You're watching WFSU PBS Kids. You're watching WFYI PBS Kids.
You're watching WEBA PBS Kids.
You're watching WGCU PBS Kids. You're watching WGTE PBS Kids. You're watching WHRO PBS Kids. You're watching WHUT PBS Kids. You're watching WITF PBS Kids. You're watching WKNO PBS Kids. You're watching WKYU PBS Kids. You're watching New Orleans PBS Kids. You're watching WLIW PBS Kids. You're watching WLRN PBS Kids. You're watching WMHT PBS Kids. You're watching WNIN PBS Kids. You're watching WNMU PBS Kids. You're watching WOSU PBS Kids. You're watching WPBS PBS Kids. You're watching WPSU PBS Kids. You're watching WQED PBS Kids. You're watching WQLN PBS Kids. You're watching WQPT Quad Cities PBS Kids. You're watching WSIU PBS Kids. You're watching WSKG PBS Kids. You're watching WSRE PBS Kids. You're watching Tennessee Valley PBS Kids. You're watching WTIU PBS Kids. You're watching WTTW PBS Kids. You're watching WTTW and PBS Kids. You're watching WTVP PBS Kids. You're watching WUCF PBS Kids. You're watching WXXI PBS Kids. You're watching Wyoming PBS Kids. You're watching New Orleans PBS Kids. You're watching KCGS 9 PBS Kids.
You're watching Go! City Public Media PBS Kids.
WETV PBS Kids. You're watching Rhode Island PBS Kids.
You're watching WDSU PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Kids.
You're watching PBS Kids.